Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle. I'll be your host again. Welcome to the new year, 2022, our first episode. Please hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell, leave a comment if you want to leave a comment. Go to our About section, represent.com. You can get t-shirts, Dutch Hunter Rendezvous, Legends Superstition Mountains in the black, the gray, the long sleeve, the short sleeve. We're done with all that. So as we move into a new year, I wanted to start out with something a little different, a little kind of like something involving research. And a lot of times people think they do a lot of research. They do the internet research. They've read a couple books, and as you see in the bookshelf behind me, I have hundreds of books concerning the superstitions, the Peraltas, the Lost Dutchman Mine, a lot of certain specific general Southwest history. One of the other areas we always get into is letters. There was a lot of correspondence. Today, people don't write letters. I even remember as a kid, my parents writing letters to family members. They would have nights we got to sit down and write, and they would write letters out, 2-3 pages, and correspond. You always got letters. And that is just kind of a thing that's kind of in the past. It hasn't been really replaced by forums or internet email or all that. It really wasn't, because letter writing was a completely different sort of a thing. One of the things that we lose because of the lack of letter writing today is the general courtesy and the decency and the respectful tones that they were in. You didn't get angry letters. And people were able to you could reveal something of yourself, where you were at, what was happening in your life with your family, what you were thinking in general. And a lot of letters become a bit of stream of consciousness. Well, Dutch hunters back in those times wrote a lot of letters too. And through the Historical Society, we've just amassed thousands and thousands of pieces of personal correspondence. And we were very fortunate at one point, through the joint efforts of a number of people, that we were able to get the correspondence of Irwin Ruth with Clay Wurst and have the letters from both sides, which you got to see each of them going back and forth. And it was a really nice collection to read through in this, especially since you're reading stuff in the 40s and 50s. And a lot of these letters come from the periods of 40s, 50s, and 60s. There are some correspondence in the 70s, and then it kind of fades. I've seen correspondence of Tom Collenborn's, Glenn McGill of the Killer Mountains, Barry Storm, and telegrams with these individuals as well. Sims Ely, Jim Bark. I think there was some stuff with Gus Barkley, even though he was not big on writing letters and responding. At times you would see in letters they would all speak, say Gus hasn't gotten back with us. Today I wanted to kind of like do a bit of one of the letters, kind of get everybody kind of engrossed in it, kind of the difference what these guys would do. They would live in the mountains and they would write. And you will catch there's names of people that I've met and I've known that are involved in these letters. The particular letter today I'm going to read was to John Burbridge. John Burbridge was, if you don't know who John Burbridge is and you thought you did a lot of research on the Lost Dutchman, you haven't even done anything more than held the onion in your hand and looked at it. You haven't peeled it at all. John Burbridge spent a lot of time in the mountains with a lot of different people. He started out with Barry Storm at one point. He wrote the Lost Monuments pamphlet booklet, but he did a lot of research, and we were very fortunate to get just the collection of his letters and correspondence. And part of that, one of the people he wrote and wrote back to him frequently was Al Morrow, who lived back in the mountains in the 50s and the 60s before his death. And we've talked about Al before. And it's just kind of a neat way to look into this. I also have some of the excerpts and some of the material from Al's diaries, which are very interesting. And maybe one day I'll sit down and read some of that, because I think it's an interesting insight, because you're getting to sit there with that person who's sitting in the mountains and talking about what he's thinking, because that's what he has. And none of us have that now, is that 365 days a year, 24/7. That's what they're thinking about. They're just spending that time in the mountains. So we're going to take a moment here and we're going to join Al Morrow as he writes John Burbridge of his time in the mountains. And this is probably, I think the date's cut off at it, but it's relatively, I think most of the letters are 65, 66, 67. So we're in the mid-60s there. Okay, so this is March 1965, I believe. Dear friend Burbridge, I got your letter a month ago, but I have gotten so far behind in my letter writing that not only now found time to answer, which doesn't quite work together, am excavating an old water course underground and at the same time following gold, lead, and volcanic conglomerate. Looks good but can't tell much. I'm working alone with both Brian and Pete. Have been nearly 2 months helping out Jake on his diggings. So I don't know who Pete is, but Brian is Brian Lickman, who went out to work with Jake, and Jake is Crazy Jake. I'll go back through that. I'm working alone. Both Brian and Pete have been nearly 2 months helping out Jake on his diggings down at Malapai Mountain. The contribution little to help out on my expenses, but they are fast spending the money they made last winter in Canada. Walter had been out looking over Jake's prospects in Labarge, so Brian says. This is supposed to be very confidential. I don't know if any deals were made. Walter, I would think, is Walter Diametrout, who was another Dutch hunter who was connected to Burbridge. So it's who I'm thinking he's referring to. I don't think it would be Walter Gassler at all. I don't think he had anything to do with Crazy Jake. I'm looking forward to your next visit. Try and make it an overnight stop if you can. I have tent space, and if Brian and Pete are not here, there will be an extra cots to sleep in. I have 2 extra sleeping bags, so you can travel light. All you need is food. Mine is kind of scarce. Things are kind of quiet out here. Freddie the freeloader told me that there was a prediction made quite some time ago concerning Blacktop Mountain. It was 5 more men will die on Blacktop Mountain before gold is found there. It's kind of funny because that's kind of almost like we're almost running into Oak Island quotation. 5 more men must die before there's gold found. By more, it means after Adolph Ruth. I don't like it. Source of prediction is questionable. Remember the 2 mines that Indians told Abe Reed about, which were near a stone resembling a horse's head set up near the end of a ridge to be a blood curse on the mines? This I found, but it is on withdrawn land. If you want to know where it is, and so on, I can tell you, but it is dangerous. Jay Clapp was investigating that area where he turned up missing. And I know where Jay Clapp was and where he was found. Maybe we'll tell that story sometime. Jay Clapp was found without his head, I believe. Tunnel, mapped, is wide open. The Hoya, or pit, is covered, but I know the site within a few yards. I was supposed to meet him here at my camp in June. I believe he's talking about Jabez Clapp. But I took sick and ended up in the hospital and didn't get here until October. He was gone then. So that was when Jabez Clapp went missing and they started searching for him and finally came up with his body. Now, there it is, and be careful who you talk with, especially local. From where I sit, I will need expenses including packing and supplies to begin with a minimum of 1 man to help me excavate and decipher signs. Something ore, it's hard to tell what he's saying, the word before that, is when the ore is hit, the mines should pay their own way. The best deal I can make is 40% net on ore from the mine. Same on any treasure that is found. Treasure divided on location and forgotten. Unless otherwise agreed. So he's basically saying when we find whatever we find, we're not even going to claim. You can just claim, we claim our shares and split it and go our own ways when we find it. Whatever he's thinking he's finding. When the ore is opened up, I must have capable backers who are not going to leave me to run the outfit alone. At that point, they can help. This setup is dynamite. If news leaks out, it would probably be better for a capable group of backers to help me open this thing up. And down all the loose ends, tie down all the loose ends before hiring labor. I'm enclosing some convincing pictures. Please return when you're through with them. Later, if you need reproductions, I have the negatives. Now, what can you cook up? Thanks for the check. Beans with chili, crackers, and hotcakes can get damn tiresome on a steady diet like I've been on the last couple of months. Your friend, Al Morrow. P.S. I will be back at Apache Junction July 14th or 15th. So that means he was staying in the mountains from March up into mid-July, and then mid-July he was coming out. He has a little map drawn here that just shows blacktop and a boulder and something that's it's non-specific. So the letter gives you some insight. One, Al was trying to find someone to give him help. Obviously, Brian and Pete had been off. And he's talking about a number of people, and he was hoping for Jabez Clapp to come in. Al was down in Needle Canyon there. Al Morrow's camp was pretty well known, the Jester. Not too many years, not too long after this is when the supposed cave-in happens and Al's killed, and we've talked about that, and Crazy Jake's implications of that of ending up with Al's map. But it's interesting because this is an individual in there, and this is he's coming up with. Now, if I read you 4 more letters, you'd find there's 4 more unique ideas. He spent a significant amount of time in that area, in the shadow of Blacktop, Weaver's Needle, in Needle Canyon with Bluff Springs Mountain. It was one of the focal points for Al for a long time. And Brian Lichtman spent quite a bit of time with him after. I think he believed he spent his time with Chuck Ayler, and then he went with Al, and then he moved up with Crazy Jake, and he might have went back to Al after that. He just, if nothing was moving or nothing was moving forward. The other thing is you get there is that Al lived pretty much off a lot of people coming through the mountains bringing supplies. So while the guys were coming through, everybody would stop in Al's camp, be able to break, rest and stuff, and then leave some supplies. Especially if coming out, they would leave the extra supplies with Al, which kind of helped sustain him. Al wrote a lot. And the letters like this give you the insight, because these are people not like you and I, who are living probably comfortably. We are able to do our research. We have tools to do our research so much differently. This is someone that sits there, and you have to imagine, no matter what information, what he's gathering, he's sitting there night after night in the canyons, probably not being able to use lanterns that often. Even if he has lights or any batteries, they're going to wear out after time. So it's a campfire, and then it's just dark, and spending a significant amount of time alone. I remember hearing one story about Al is the animals had become so accustomed to him living in the area that they would just come into his camp and they had no problem with Al being there. The birds could land on his shoulder and would just be all over everything. And then a moment someone was coming into camp, he knew, because all the animals would leave the area. So he kind of became one with the area, which has its romantic notion, but it's something we can't ascertain and whatnot. Now, there is a manuscript that was supposedly written by Al, and I think it was. It doesn't go into a lot of detail. A lot of Al's stories, figuratively, were on a lot of other subject matter and more interesting, but he didn't put them. I don't think he was trying to write a book. I think he was just trying to write something to kind of some explanation of his thoughts concerning the Peraltas, the Gonzaleses, and the area where he thought the Dutchman Mine was. But Al was very contemporary, because we have to remember in the 50s and 60s, it's quite the old school of Dutch hunters that are still around. Abe Reed, Andy Sinbad would be around still for many years. You had John Burbridge, Barry Storm. Crazy Jake had come into the area, but then you have the next group of in the 60s and 70s that would be relevant in there. Probably Bob Ward's already there. Chuck Crawford would be coming in around that time as well, I would think. So all these guys start coming in, and Al was kind of like a centerpiece for all that. Glenn McGill on Killer Mountains in the 60s, obviously, met Al. So reading those letters, though, gives you that insight. It gives you insight into his camp, where he was at, where his head was at. He's looking to find someone to help him out. He's one individual. I think I've got something. I need to dig it out. The testament to people like Al and a lot of people back in the mountains was they would go in and they would dig these tunnels or these prospects out of solid rock, and you can't sit back and you don't really know what they were digging for. But when you take one individual and understand the primitive means that they were doing this, then it's a testament to what they could do, as well as their survival back in the mountains. So the letters are always interesting. The diaries are always interesting, and it's something that we're lacking and missing. I think if people don't have access or the ability to get into these resources. Recently I was able, the original letters, make copies of probably a couple dozen of Al's with John Burbridge, and I was able to pick up some of Barry Storm's correspondence and some other things. And I always like to bring those to collections because it's always something you can look at and reflect on their failures and there's some of their successes in areas they covered and know what they covered in detail. A lot of times in books, people go with the oral tradition or stories that have been passed on, and they fall their ways into books. And what happens is we get kind of distinctly a turn of a bit of a different story. So hearing Al's own words of what he thinks at various times, I know there's one letter I read where Al believes that he found some stone maps and dug up some stone maps in an area and a heart stone that weighed 100 pounds and a number of different things. To see that in writing and him to say, well, I found these things in the mountains, but he didn't believe the heart stone, I don't think was Spanish. He thought, I believe in the letter he discusses, he believes it had to do with the Apaches and that the Spanish used it. And he said there was markings, but he wasn't sure if they were natural or something worked. Now there's no photographs of these things. There is the Jacobwald stone, the 1887 stone and stuff. There's photographs in his camp of Al found those things, and who knows how authentic those are when he found them in the 50s. But Al was a pretty good researcher. He put a lot of time in, but you have to wonder, as you put the days and the weeks and the months and then the years in, and the health of these individuals where they were at. And this is during a time period after, but he had already survived the time between Celeste Jones and Ed Piper up by Weaver's Needle. He was a bit of tried to be the peacemaker between those two factions and camps while they were shooting it up, which is another good story to share one time. But I like to get into these little kind of nuanced little stories about those guys back in there because Al put a significant time in the mountains. He lived barely hand to mouth. John Burbridge covered a lot of ground. In fact, one of the things I was told and early on, the reason I went through John Burbridge's material so much was so many Dutch hunters you'll find stick to the trails. They didn't get much more than 50 yards, 100 yards from any trail. John Burbridge cut just right through the brush. He found monuments, stones, things that don't survive today that he documented and photographed that we wouldn't have any idea of, and we don't sometimes know where the exact locations were, but he tried to be detailed and he shared his information. He was also part of the group that had the Frank Fish map from Erie Schaefer passed to her from Frank Fish and was involved in that. Burbridge was one of those people that didn't try to kind of spin stories. He just tried to state facts of what he had. Frank and I think both found just tantalizing, very interesting what he did, because he was probably could have written one of the best documented books on treasure hunting and the superstitions. And what we have is just letters and notes, but he was an incredible individual, incredible legacy of what he left behind, as did with Al and with a lot of these people. So I hope everybody enjoyed this. I hope they like the whole idea of the letter writing aspect. If we're not writing it down, if we're just putting the internet, it just can be deleted. It can happen here. I mean, just like our YouTube account, 3 strikes and you're out. Well, anything anybody puts into YouTube could be, it's not going to be necessarily forever preserved, because they could say, oh, well, we had a problem with this, this, and this, 3 strikes, and then everything's deleted and it's gone forever. And letter writing, the nice thing about this is we've all made the copies, Historical Society, various private collections. Those things survive, and they survive out there for us to share and be able to talk about. And they may not give you directions to mine, obviously, because the individual didn't find it, but they give you an idea how they were searching, their approaches. And it teaches us within our approach, like I always say, if your feet aren't on the ground, you're not taking a physical sample. If you're not looking at the rock, if you're not really able to get there within a few feet of what you're looking for physically, it doesn't really matter, because you can sit there and shout from 100 yards away, that's what it looks like. Oh, this is a stone door in solid rock. Until you get there and can actually prove it, it doesn't mean anything. So these gentlemen, Al Morrow, John Burbridge, were guys that physically were there. Barry Storm was physically there, regardless of some of the things he said. Bob Ward was physically there. They went through the mountains, and I think they would look at the technology today and shake their heads and just think that just makes a man lazy and doesn't make him truly what he needs to be. Interesting, John Burbridge was a bit of a prospector. I don't know about Al Morrow. I didn't know, and I don't know enough people that knew him personally close enough to know at what his prospecting skills were at, which is another interesting subject matter I'll have to cover sometime, is the difference between treasure hunters and prospectors, and how very, very often those two things don't interconnect. It was one thing about our show that was very important, is that it was a bunch of individuals who, whether they were into geology or rock hounding or mining or prospecting, but it was that with some of the treasure tales. And when you connect that, you start looking at things a bit differently. So before we go, to add on to from last week's video, Frank and I came up pretty much empty. Most all the prospects, everything we hit had absolutely zero content in gold. This was all crushed down and basically became just flour. It just was like sand. What we would have done if we found gold content is then crushed it less and tried to see what type of gold content was, whether it was flour within the area or there was some nuggets or something. We have an area where we did find gold, and we're going to continue to go back there, but we wanted to catch a number of other prospects. Part of this is where you put an X through an area. So each area we find a little gold, each area we don't. We're noting these things and kind of keeping track of these various places. It's not necessarily saying these guys didn't find anything. It's saying we can't find any content of anything they were looking for. We are also looking at platinum, lead, anything else possibly in, the spectrum of what they could have been searching for, because there are people that search for various different elements, and those metallic elements had a different value. Nickel had its value at one time. So we're looking to see anything of those type of elements, and that also involves, when we find pieces and so forth, is trying to melt them and just be able to look at what we're looking at, like chemically into them. So we came up empty on that and the prospect, which is unfortunate, but we still have a couple good spots, and then we have another number of other areas we're going to go out and do samples too, because the idea is to find some new ground or find in the area where other people were looking what they were looking for. So it's kind of combining that historical thing with everything else, and we'll get into that a bit later on. But this whole new year, a lot of stuff like this, we'll go through letters, we'll go through diaries, we'll tell some stories, do some personal anecdotes, and the episodes will be rolling around. My promise from Trevor, who's standing right there before me right now, is the episodes he's going to be getting that next bunch done, and probably through this winter the next batch will probably get done, so we'll be able to kind of like get them out, and then after a bit of a break again we'll probably get another series of them out and see where we're going with all that. We got a great story to tell. It was just COVID and those limitations really, really hurt us. And I think people sometimes kind of go like, but it was just you guys. You didn't need all these camera crews and all. But it's still the health and the safety of the people around you. And if one person has a cold and then this, and then you have the COVID problem, and with the health of Frank or Woody or someone, you can't just go out and do what you're going to do. We saw what almost happened to Woody, and that's just kind of, it's wrong to put anybody in that possible situation, which the last time we shot, it was Apple iPhone again, because Trevor had a bit of a cold, and I'm not going to risk it. He did test negative for COVID, but I'm not going to put Frank at risk to get him sick, because that's where we ended up during the COVID hit. Frank was out sick, and then COVID came, and we never were able to get back out. I'm not going to risk somebody's health in the long term for something short term like this. So I hope everybody's having a happy new year. I hope everybody's having a good time. I hope everybody enjoyed this, kind of learned and picked something up for it, looking forward to it. But we are looking forward to 2022 and kind of getting out there and things going on. I hope to see everybody, not this weekend, but on I believe, the 8th, 100th anniversary of Apache Junction. Me, Frank, and Woody will be out in Apache Junction. We were going to set up and do something out there, but then we changed our mind and decided not to. Part of that reasoning is they gave us a really difficult time of how to set up things and stuff, and they weren't being very communicative. They were just kind of like making us literally just constantly trying to get a hold of them. Well, what do you need us to do? What do you need us to do? So that's unfortunate, but we're going to go out and hang out and kind of see what's out there and hang out with the crowd. We'll be out in the mountains a bit during that period of time. And then coming up, look at the schedule for the Superstition Mountain Museum. Teton Ken will be out giving us a lecture, and then the following 2 lectures after that will be myself, and that'll be good times. Some really interesting stuff, some good stuff, different than Chasing Legends, different than our episodes and stuff. It'll be a lecture series I've been kind of pretty much following through this whole fall, doing before different groups of people. I think everyone's enjoyed it so far and had a really good time and found it very interesting, and it's just getting more and more refined. So I hope everybody will be out there. I'm looking forward to see you. I think it's like 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something on Thursdays at the museum. But hope to see everybody out there. Hope everybody's well. Hope everybody's healthy. So until the next time, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. And this was Chasing Legends.